Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. We are joined today by Dr. Kaveh Ehsani, who will discuss the subaltern history of oil in Iran. His lecture will unpack the social, political, and geographic histories of oil in Iran during the formative first quarter of the 20th century. Professor Ehsani will focus on the urban history of the refinery city of Abadan and the province of Khuzestan to demonstrate how novel forms of urban politics and labor struggle emerged during the period and convey their lasting effect. Kaveh Ehsani is Professor of International Studies at DePaul University in Chicago. He is an expert on labor in Iran and labor movements in Iran. His books include Social History of Oil in Iran, which was published in Persian in 2019, and he's also the co-editor of Working for Oil, Comparative Social Histories of Labor in the Global Oil Industry. Professor Ehsani has worked as a regional planner at the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, Johns Hopkins Institute for Policy Studies, and in Iran on water resources, planning, urban governance, and post-war reconstruction. He's on the board of directors of MER, Middle East Research and Information Project, and a contributing editor of the journal Middle East Report, and also Iranian Studies, and the Tehran-based journal Guftagoo, or Dialogue in English. Thank you, Kaveh, for joining us today as part of the Iranian Studies lecture series. We're delighted and thrilled to have you with us. Before we get started, I'll ask our audience if you would like to hear the lecture in English or in Arabic. There's an interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. If you put it on Spanish, you will hear it in Arabic. You can submit your comments through the Q&A feature of Zoom or by commenting on the live stream posts of the event of the Arab Center's various media platforms. So we're in for a treat. Professor Ehsani has agreed kindly to take some questions after his talk. And so without further ado, Kaveh, I'll turn it over to you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kamrava, for this generous invitation. I am delighted to be addressing an audience mainly from our region and to share some of the work that I've been doing with you all. My project, focuses on exploring this relationship between oil, politics, and social relationships. I mean, we're all aware that oil has played a formative role in shaping our region of the world and the world in general. I mean, we do live in an oil civilization. Fossil fuel civilization. Every aspect of life is shaped by resources like coal, oil, and natural gas. And in the Persian Gulf in particular, the whole region was first named and labeled as Persian Gulf by American military strategists and British colonialists in India as the Middle East. In large part, because of the strategic forethinking about the role of oil and geopolitics, right? So, our part of the world has really been shaped by this view of oil as being formative in shaping our societies, our politics, relations of power, and material life. The question is how? How has oil actually shaped, politics, relations of power, states, institutions and material life? That's a question that began to really strike me maybe 20 years ago. And I was very, I became very discontent with a lot of its formulations, especially notions that oil creates as if the oil has an agency by itself, is creating rentier states, and oil is creating political corruption, or it's a curse rather than a blessing, right? I found these formulas very problematic because they began to give and assign a kind of agency to, oil that I did not think it has. The question was, well, what kind of social settings has this oil being, this new source of energy being introduced to and used that then has been molded and shaped around, around this extraction, processing, and export. So because we don't have a lot of time, so let me say this, that my point is in this research that to understand the impact of oil on politics and society and environment, we need to actually see where all the key agents, all the key actors around this complex of oil, production, processing, export, consumption, where do they interact? Where do they encounter each other? And how do their relationships get shaped and shape an environment? So what I'm talking about is multinational oil companies, national governments, governmental institutions, and local populations. Where do they actually interact? They interact in what I call, following David Harvey and geographers, geographic discourse, I call it the built environment of oil. What kind of geography has oil built? The cities, refineries, pipelines, installations, around which all these social and political relationships had to kind of encounter each other, take shape, interact, fight, struggle, negotiate, haggle, and sometimes come into conflict. And for me, that is a particular geography in Iran where oil was first discovered in 1908, and then began to kind of become a major source of energy, first for the British Empire, which had a monopoly over it in Iran, and then, in the Arabian Peninsula, in Iraq, elsewhere. And it really began to kind of transform through different stages of history, political and social and geographic relationships, right? So that's why I'm kind of to understand the impact of oil. I do look at its geography. I do want to look at the spaces that it created. And in particular, I'm looking at the refinery city of Abadan, but not only Abadan itself, but all the surrounding areas from whence people came, and this was Khuzestan province in Iran, in southwest Iran, where oil was first discovered, was mainly populated by pastoral nomads, Bakhtiari pastoral nomads, and tribal Arabs of various, tribes and confederacies, and urban populations. And their lives became intertwined and completely transformed by the introduction of oil capitalism and all the political relations that came with it. So this is what I want to share with you. And my argument will be by looking at this micro history of where and how, the oil emerged, the oil capitalism and oil complex emerged and was shaped in the formative first quarter of 20th century. What I want to point out is that aside from oil as a big source of revenue for the government or a very strategic substance, it began to be created sets of social relationships that were entirely novel, right? Working class, labor, but especially urban forms of agency began to take shape that in Iran, in the case of Iran, because this is what I'm focusing on for this book that I'm writing right now, but in the long run, I'm doing a lot of comparative work as well on this, because I think this is a pattern. And what I'm offering is a methodology for analyzing oil. and its social impact. Around it began to take shape forms of urban consciousness and urban agency that did not exist in this form before. So oil did shape modern social relationships, but not in the way that we expected, not in the way that is usually transcribed in the official historiographies of oil, which really focus on the role of the state, of colonial powers, on large corporations, or maybe labor activism and radical politics around oil. But what I'm much more interested in is the everyday life of ordinary people. And how they were shaped, and how did they shape, in turn, the way that this whole oil complex took shape in the region, right? So I'm much more interested in the role of women, in the role of criminals, in the role of landlords, small petty landlords, urban dwellers, expatriates, refugees who came in their thousands during this period and settled in these oil cities, and how did they bond together and began to kind of form a new urban consciousness and fight for the right to the city as citizens, for who were clamoring for quite ordinary things like drinking water or public health or urban infrastructure to be extended to them, or to be compensated if they were being dispossessed and moved around by the oil corporation or the Iranian government. And it's fascinating when we do this kind of microhistory to realize that it's not only these urban citizens, these migrants and refugees who begin to kind of mold together new forms of urban agency and consciousness, but the central state and state institutions began to respond to this and basically begin to re-articulate and redefine their role as agents of governmentality. That, okay, this is the response. Now we see this is the responsibility of a modern state institution to extend this kind of protection and this kind of service, because otherwise we would not have the kind of legitimacy that we are asking for, the legitimacy of being the national Iranian government representing all Iranians, not that we're kind of consolidating this nation and eliminating local autonomies and all that. The same thing goes for major multinational oil corporations. Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which is today BP, was in charge of, and had a monopoly of oil production in Iran during this period. And they had to kind of come up with, in response to these urban upheavals and demands that were completely unexpected, they had to come up with notions of providing social welfare and infrastructure, and responding and accepting that their operation is not purely a commercial one, but it has huge local social repercussions that would actually affect their own personnel as well, and they had to kind of take care of these things. So that's the setting that I want to kind of share with you. I don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to share a few slides. And so I hope everybody can see this. Okay. So let me move this aside. All right. A brief, very kind of telegraphed list of really formative, important events that takes place. So 1901, the Qajar monarch ruling Iran, Muzaffaruddin Shah, grants an oil concession to William Darcy, a Australian-British prospector, but to kind of search for oil in Iran. And they begin explorations in the southwest of Iran, on the border with the Ottoman Empire, which is today Iraq, in these regions. But 1906 to 1911, there is a constitutional revolution that takes place in Iran. And at the national level, the entire legitimacy of, authoritarian monarchy comes under question. And, not only a parliament is established, but this whole idea that political power has to be responsible to national legislation and the rule of law becomes widespread and accepted, although the entire country, for various reasons that we don't have time to go into, goes into a crisis. And basically, we have a meltdown of any kind of central authority for the next decade or so. By 1907, Russia and Britain divide Iran into spheres of influence to protect their own empires, mainly from the incursion of an alliance between Ottomans and Germans through Turkey. And this means that, for our story, this means that there is a lot of local autonomy given to local tribes and local centers of power and local elites, provincial elites, with virtually no control from the center. And Iranian nationalism, especially in Tehran and large cities in the north that were at the core of the constitutional revolution, begin to kind of consider any kind of local autonomy as a threat to national integrity, but also to the rule of constitutional rule. Because if you can have a set of rules down in the south by local tribes, then what does that mean in terms of national laws and national sovereignty? Oil is discovered in 1908 in the province of Khuzestan in the mountain region of Masjid Suleiman, which is right about here. The British oil company, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, builds a refinery in the city of Abadan, right on the border on Shatt al-Arab River, right on the border with Iraq here. The First World War, Iran is neutral, but is effectively invaded by opposing armies. It's a very weak power. This leads to enormous hardship for ordinary people for various reasons, confiscation of their grain, of their animals for troop transport and all that, of labor for working in the refinery or building infrastructure or helping the war effort elsewhere. So there is enormous social suffering imposed by a war that Iran has no part of and is basically a victim of. And by 1917 to 1920s, when the war ends, we have the beginning of various political movements, nationalism, socialism, labor strifes that begin to frame profound grassroots discontent with the state of affairs. And they're rooted in everyday struggles of ordinary people. Next door, Russia has a revolution, Soviet Union is formed, Ottoman Empire falls apart. By the end of First World War, Britain is the absolute superpower in India, in the Persian Gulf, and in this region. At the height of his power, when it's controlling southern Iran and has total domination, a coup d'etat takes place in Tehran. A military leader, Reza Khan, who coronates himself by 1926, establishes the Pahlavi monarchy, comes to power, right? And the British actually welcome this because they want a strong central government in Iran, which basically overlooks the rule of law and centralizes the country. So they deal with one effective military power that will put down all sorts of discontent and local autonomies and all that. But here's an important point that I want to make, that at the very height of its absolute apparent power, Britain suddenly begins to encounter small movements of resistance that don't have to do with grand politics of nationalism or socialism or any kind of a utopian alternative to the existing system, but they begin to demand citizenship rights and rights to the city. And this is what I want to concentrate on, because in the city of Abadan, where the British army is based off of it, in Basra, and has its navy there and is in complete control. It's a city that is built. They want to kind of clear a neighborhood next to the refinery, and in order to build a modern food center, a modern bazaar, which at this time. Let's remember, we're talking about 1921. This is just when the first global pandemic, the Spanish flu, has just ended. And as I will discuss if I have time, this is, Abadan and Khuzestan and Iran are at the epicenter of successive epidemics, of public health crises, including the Spanish flu, but also cholera and plague and malaria and so on and so forth, that basically during this period wipe out about a third of the national population. A national population that is profoundly weakened by hunger, by destitution, by the impact of the war, ceaseless war, and the collapse of political authority, and all networks of provisioning and economic interaction, right? So now let's kind of go focus on Abadan. So 1908, oil is struck. The setting that we're talking about, the Zagros Mountains, the land of pastoral nomadic Bakhtiaris, this is where oil is discovered. This is the river Karun, which joins the Shatt al-Arab with Tigris and Euphrates. This is the landscape that the British oil company begins to kind of explore. Now, one of my arguments is that the discovery of oil and the beginning of extraction of it leads to the social destruction of Bakhtiari economic and political and social structures, because they make a pact with the Bakhtiari Khans. These are the British contractors with Bakhtiari leaders who are basically collective leaders in charge of collective land for the tribe as a whole. Right? They make a pact through which they become enriched, and they basically privatize collective rights of a tribe that uses a landscape for reproduction of its nomadic pastoral ways of life. I mean, they move seasonally, with their sheep, and they graze and they produce wool, and there's textile, and but once you kind of enclose that pasture land and turn it into the permanent private property of the oil company, no longer this form of geographic mobility, seasonal mobility is possible. Not only this, but the role of the tribal leaders who were supposed to represent the collective interest of at least a dozen different sub-tribe groups, who basically benefit themselves, end up, becoming urban landlords and becoming enriched and moving basically out of the whole equation of tribal relationships, leaves this patriarchal system headless. And to the extent that the tribal leaders try and attempt to remain in positions of authority, they lose a lot of legitimacy. So you basically have a collapse of a social system that depends on this loose hierarchical and patriarchal system, and really relies on its seasonal use of territory and land. Now, meanwhile, the construction of infrastructure of oil and its built environment, pipelines, roads, access roads, bringing in material and all that, requires a relentless demand for labor, for land, and for materials. And this comes from tribesmen who have been dispossessed, who have nothing left, who have to rely on wage labor. So we really have this primitive accumulation of capital, to use Marx's term, that really begins to transform social relationships, not in the cities of oil, but in its countryside, in its periphery. And basically proletarianizes vast chunks of the population, male population, and their families, who have no other means of livelihood left to them, but to go and sell their labor to build the infrastructure of oil. As I mentioned, this is a period that brings tremendous suffering to ordinary people, the war, but also the kind of social disruption that I mentioned. And obviously with it, a lot of anger, but also a lot of massive movements of population in their tens of thousands, who just move to emerging oil, this emerging geography of oil, because there's no other means of livelihood. So this is a bird's eye view of this region. So Abadan is here. Masjid Suleiman, as I mentioned, where oil was discovered. So in the Bakhtiari Mountains here is where oil is discovered and extracted, and then transferred through pipelines that have to be built to the refinery city of Abadan and its neighboring port city of Khorramshahr. So this built environment of oil is affecting a huge area and very different modes of social life. So by 1918, 1920, this is what Abadan looks like. It's become a global city because it's exporting, as famously Lord Curzon, the foreign minister and the viceroy of India and the foreign minister of Britain during the war and after, mentioned, Britain floated to victory on a sea of oil, on a sea of Iranian oil, extracted and in Masjid Suleiman and exported from Abadan. That's how the British Navy and its army used this new fossil fuel by converting from coal to oil, using tanks, airplanes, using this fuel to fight the war. So it played a very strategic role, and by this time it was already a global city. Now, I hope, since the audience is mainly in Qatar and Arabian Peninsula, and we're talking regionally, this is a theme that keeps getting repeated, that oil brought modernity, and there was nothing there, and this industry developed the land, and local populations were either not present, this was empty land, or that in fact it was improved on by the operations of oil and the kind of industrial modernity and mining extractive modernity that it brought along. This is a very famous picture from the official history of British Petroleum Company, and the subtitle in the book is an empty land. This is Abadan, which was an island, empty land, and to me this is quite striking that the official records would put this as visual evidence of emptiness, where in fact, you have date plantations in the distance, irrigation ditches, and obviously not fallow, but obviously cultivated land and date orchards that are obviously being used. And there's nothing empty, unimproved, unused about this visual representation of oil and what it replaced. That there was nothing, it was just desert, that we made it bloom. Well, not quite. And this is a story that basically goes across the board. I don't have a whole lot of time, so let me maybe rush ahead. The point is that Abadan became a city of 50, 60,000 by mid-1920s. It was a highly divided city of expatriate, posh and affluent areas, and destitute migrant areas where people were just settled in, under kapar, under temporary housing. This is sewage gathering here, and so on and so forth. Right now, the story I don't have time to tell because my time is up, but let me just kind of rush through it and say that this is the British company wanted to build this new bazaar because they feared pandemics, they feared disease, they wanted to basically modernize the area. And food was a very important part of this because everybody was eating food. And if you have 50, 60,000 people living in and around the refinery, and maybe 30,000 of them are not working at the refinery, they're just refugees, and you can't push them out because they're huge. And maybe you need them for temporary labor and so on and so forth. You need to kind of, the British felt, the refinery felt that, we need to bring health measures and control, and through these modern means of provisioning and supplying consumer goods, modernize the population itself. So it learns how to behave, how to buy food, how to keep accounts, how to buy the supply and buy the right kind of food, which is healthy and not rotten and not contaminated, and so on and so forth. To do this, they had to remove something like 20,000 people who were living in this neighborhood. This population were from all over. We have no records of them because they have left no records. They were poor, they were not literate, but they began to resist and refuse to be removed. And this destitute population, which came from all over, they happened to be, they started writing petitions to the parliament that had in Tehran, to the court, both before, to the Qajar court, but also afterwards to the Pahlavi court. They resisted for 3 years and refused to be moved unless they were properly compensated, or that they were given the right to remain where they had squatted, at this point. At this very point in time, the central government of Iran, Reza Shah, made a military move and removed the Arab tribal leader, Sheikh Khaz'al, from power. Therefore, the local allies of the British Oil Company, the tribal confederacy of Banu Ka'b and Sheikh Khaz'al's powerful leader, were no longer in a position to actually manhandle and push people out. The British were caught in a very sensitive situation because they were an oil company. They were not supposed to be a military power. They were supposed to be a private commercial oil company, not the arm of the British Empire, a state. So they kind of tiptoed around this issue, and they said, well, who's going to do this? And they asked the Iranian military to actually step in now that they had come into the province and push people out. But then the Iranian military and the local bureaucrats, the few of them who were there, began to receive these petitions and saying that, look, we're saying that we represent the Iranian people, but these are the Iranian people, and they're speaking in the name of being Iranian citizens, being pushed out by a foreign power and a military power and a corporate power, the British Oil Company, that is stealing our resources and not giving us any money for it either. So aren't we supposed to be protecting these people? And isn't the role of the new state, the modern nation state, actually providing the basic infrastructure like water, housing, potable water, and food provisioning, and so on and so forth, that people are asking? Isn't that the role of the state? So actually, in these correspondences and in this micro history, we begin to see this, the agents of the state beginning to articulate the idea not of only domination of the state and kind of excluding or eliminating local challenges to it, autonomous local challenges to it, but also the other side, what Foucault refers to as the governmental responsibility of actually showing that they care about the welfare for all, and that they are actually gaining legitimacy by providing that welfare for all. All of this comes from a protracted resistance by this local population that refused to be removed. And who are these local populations? So to conclude, the local populations I'm talking about, from their petitions, from the names that they've put to the petitions, you begin to realize that they're from all over the place. They happen to be ethnically Arab. Maybe some of them are actually oil workers working in the refinery, but they hate to put their name forward as oil workers because they'd lose a very valuable job, but it doesn't pay them enough. They have to live in a very poor area, but they hide behind their wives. They hide behind their neighbors. The neighbors come from all over, from Bushehr, from Azerbaijan, because of their names, because of the how they've signed the petitions. So in short, instead of ethnic groups banding together, instead of Arabs or Bakhtiaris or Lors or Bushehris or workers banding together, what we see is neighbors basically finding the same voice and articulating through successive written petitions and objections to both the oil company and appeals to the central government that we should have this right as urban citizens to be properly treated by the oil company and by our own government. So let me end there because I think I'm out of time. There's a lot more to say, but we can discuss that during the question and answer.
Perfect, Kaveh. This was absolutely fantastic. My sincere thanks. I could sit here for hours and listen to you, and I'm sure so can our audience. Thank you so much for that really thought-provoking and insightful analysis. There's a couple of questions. I'll get right to them. I'll just go directly to them. I have a number of questions myself, but I'll go first to our audiences and their questions. Can you say a little bit about your sources, particularly in terms of the numbers and the refugees and workers, residents? Can you just, from a research perspective, say a couple of things about your sources? Sorry, you're mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I began to work on Khuzestan in, what was it, 1989 until 92. When I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, working on my dissertation. So I went there and I worked on rural areas. Abadan was a war zone, although I managed to go there several times. I was mainly working on reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, but really looking at rural areas. And so, I was doing an ethnography. I was living in a village and at the same time working as a planner and all that. And I became really interested in Abadan because I just kind of kept running into people in this refugee camp or, like in this remote part that, happened to be from Abadan or an oil city. And they were quite different. I mean, in terms of like their approach, how they interacted. And I just became fascinated by the place. And I started going to these places, to Masjid Suleiman, to Abadan and all that. And because a lot of my work was on like thinking about cities and urban areas and geography, I wrote a piece in 1999 about Abadan as a oil company town, and how had the history of Abadan shaped urban planning in Iran, and where had it come from? Like this particular design of the city and the kind of urban culture that it had. So from then, I discovered the BP archives, the BP's national art, BP company's archive had just opened up at the University of Warwick in Britain. So even though I didn't have any money, I was a student, I was in the US, but then I was going back and forth in Iran. I started stopping there and I began doing a lot of archival work, even though I wasn't a historian, at the BP archives in Warwick. And so that lasted 2-3 years, many trips. I just like take a lot of notes about, about the city mostly and everyday life. And then I began to work much more seriously on a book project, maybe in 1912. And I began to, actually in the 20s. So I began to do a lot of research in the Iranian archives. Iranian National Archives. So basically, this is the combination of the sources that I have. I'd say, maybe 7-8 years of protracted ethnographic research in Khuzestan, but also in Abadan. I have a lot of connections in Abadan, in Khuzestan that I cultivated. So like very much about contemporary, post-Second World War, post-Iran-Iraq War, period of looking at the urban fabric, social relations of the present, and really writing about this and kind of thinking about it. And then a huge amount of archival research, in Britain and in in Iranian, various Iranian archives.
Thank you.
And then a lot of, I mean, you have to frame this, theoretically, so I think I bring a lot of theoretical framing to it to try to explain all this data.
Right. So a couple of other questions. First of all, what was the relationship between municipality, the province, and the central state in both theoretically and also insofar as the ordinary people were concerned? And then I suppose related to that, how could we think about the impact of oil capitalism differently if there was already agrarian capitalism before oil? For example, through relations of debt between moneylenders and cultivators of commodities like dates.
Mm-hmm. Well, so two questions, both interesting. And both kind of historical. I mean, relations of municipality, I mean, when? 1920, 1925, 1930, like this is a process, not, so there's no standard answer to it. Here's what I can tell you about the period I spoke of. In that period, the only representatives of the central government in the province of Khuzestan are 2 or 3 kargozar, basically representatives. Nobody else. There's nobody else, right? And these are people from outside, not native Khuzestanis, who basically, don't know the place. They are at the mercy. They have no budget. They're at the mercy of the oil company to house them. To kind of maybe give them a car. I mean, we're talking about a absolutely, not bankrupt, but destitute state that has nothing. That is completely, on the verge of collapse. The entire country. Because of the impact of war and political, disruption and all that. I would argue, and I've done this in detail in the book that Professor Kamrava mentioned that came out in Iran, and I'm working on the English version of it. That really, right now, I'm working a lot on the Second World War and the Allied occupation of Khuzestan, because that's a really missing story. But for the period that we discussed, 1920s, there is no municipality. But these, and this is, I've provided detailed accounts of this, but, like these cargos are these representatives of the central government who are writing these reports, constantly to Tehran and to the Majlis and to the courts and hoping somebody listens. They're saying, look, we need a municipality. This is the idea of municipality, right? Let's build, let's take charge of this, but then we don't have a budget. Let's haggle with the British that they should pay for it, right? Because we should be doing this. We should be building a modern sanitary bazaar because, like food is killing people because it's all contaminated, and the British are, like the British oil companies saying, yeah, you need a municipality because, we pay all these people, expatriates from India and Britain to come, and nobody wants to come here because there's so much disease and public health crisis and pandemics. And they don't realize, well, a lot of it has not to do with what people, what they call native people eat. It's because those native people are your servants. They come. There is no segregation. Like, so if you have these villas and palaces that you're living in, the lawn is being mowed by your servants. The food is being cooked by your servants, and these servants don't have any money, so they go and live in these areas that are. So it's the lesson we're learning again with COVID now. That pandemics don't recognize class divisions or rich and poor. They affect everyone. It's a common issue. So out of these crises, these ideas of the necessity of municipal governance comes out. And the important thing is that there's a big fight over, well, who has sovereignty over municipal control or local control? Should it be the oil company? Should it be the Iranian government? Who's in charge of this? It's an issue of power as well. It's not just provision of welfare, but it's the legitimacy of power and whose power. They both want it and they both don't want it, right? Because it involves money, it involves expertise that may or may not exist. It involves management and responsibility and carrying it out. And, it's like, so political authorities and commercial authorities want it, but they don't want to pay for it and they don't want to be in charge of it. And they need to develop this expertise because it doesn't exist. So I'm sorry, I don't want to go too long, but I do want to make this point that maybe it didn't come out. One of the things that we in our region keep kind of thinking maybe subconsciously is that this kind of industrial capitalist modernity came from outside. That this is a gift of, it's maybe a gift of a corrupted gift or a doomed gift of, European civilization and the West and all that. When you actually kind of study in detail, well, how did this industry emerge? You realize that the British had no idea what they were doing, right? This expertise did not exist elsewhere, and was supplanted here. It had to develop in this constant haggle and in this constant encounter with local soil, with local geography, with local knowledge, with local people. And we, as maybe not equal, but as certainly participants and some often victims of this process, have been integral to its development. This is our history as well. It's not an imposed history and it's not an imported history. It's a melange and it's a, assembly of these different forms of knowledge and labor and resources and suffering that has created it. Yeah, sorry. There was another question about date and agriculture, but maybe in the next round I'll.
Yeah. And, there's a couple of, there's a number of questions and we're running short of time. So if I could ask that you keep your answers brief. You kind of alluded to this. There's a comment about the fact that in the archives of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, company directors wanted to charge the central government in Tehran for the services they were providing for the population. And you kind of alluded to that. There's this haggling process that's going on, as you mentioned. Now, Kaveh, one of the things you talked about was this proletarianization of these nomadic tribes, that they were inadvertently or forcibly settled. Did any of these workers have previous experience working in resource extraction? For example, did any of them come from Baku, or were they primarily local?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. By and large, until the 1920s, the vast majority come from, Bakhtiaris and from India, and from the coast of the Persian Gulf, especially Bushehr and those areas, right? So from the, although there is a huge number, the vast majority of workers in Baku, in the Russian oil industry, are from Azerbaijan, and they get displaced after both 1905, but especially 1917 revolutions there. There's a huge resistance and sensitivity by the British Oil Company to allow them to come and work, even though they're like highly valued skills and they have all that experience, because they're politicized. They were at the forefront of the Iranian workers, as Turaj Atabatki's work has shown, were very much part of the socialist movement. They were politicized by, these various political parties, both Menshevik and SR, but also Bolsheviks. Nationalism was very strong among them. So they were not apolitical workers. And that really struck fear in the British Oil Company. So Khuzestan was effectively a militarized zone. oil production areas were all kind of surrounded by barbed wire and highly guarded by, Bakhtiyari guards and all that. And they kept tap on who was coming, and Azerbaijani workers were not welcomed until mid 1920s. There are few exceptions, and Yousef Eftekhari's memoirs, a communist labor organizer who went to Khuzestan and played a big role in the 1929 organizing the 1929 labor strike is an exception, but even Eftekhari kind of mentions that, they're, mostly Lor and Arab and, Indian and from southern Iran rather than the north.
So this leads to the next question, which is, we obviously know that oil benefited the oil company and to a much lesser extent, the central government in Tehran. But did it have any benefits for those in the lower social strata, the workers, the marginal the population that lived in local areas, or anyone else?
This is one of those questions that begs to ask, a further question that, benefit, because it's a kind of a rational choice language, benefit versus what kind of loss, what costs did it bring, weigh it against its benefits, right? So because of the way that oil became of such strategic importance from basically 1900 onward, this whole region was transformed. I mean, from top down by both national governments that were emerging at this time and kind of began to think of these resources as their patrimony and that they should be sovereign over. So it really shaped resource nationalism in Iran, certainly across the Gulf. I think it shaped a lot of calculations by the British about how they territorially divided the trucial states, like the Emirat, Qatar, like that. Certainly, like these kinds of calculations played a big role in shaping modern nation states. And then, in Iran, as I said, I mean, it was accompanied by direct intrusion and dismantling of social structures. So there's nothing we can romanticize about those social structures, but they were the livelihood and the organic social structures of local populations, for better or for worse. And they were dismantled by force, and this is what modern capitalism has done from the onset, from Native Americans to Siberians. I mean, expanding and, a national space, a nation state, and creating a national market has enormously destructive consequences, as well as environmental, right? Now, I don't think it serves us at this point with all the ecological crises and everything that we're seeing to kind of resort again to the language of, did it benefit? Yeah, it created a modern city, and it created modern forms of wage labor, and it's freed women from patriarchal structures. Yes, but let's also kind of evaluate the kind of modernity, the kind of environment, the kind of models of energy consumption that it brought, and the kind of disempowering that it entailed. So I'm not comfortable with this issue, with this language of, this Monty Python language that, colonialism, dominated us, but it also brought us aquifers and this and that. Yes, but I don't think we can do this kind of evaluation. Let's deal with this history with both the destructive as well as the transformative impacts that it had, and then kind of use it to figure out what about the present. I mean, how do we want to think about the politics and political economy and ecology of oil now, in our societies? What lessons are we learning from that history that we don't have any control over?
This actually leads quite neatly into the next question. I have two questions left, if you would allow me. One is, how does your theoretical model, if at all, explain the 1979 revolution? Or does it, or are they part of different historical processes?
I mean, my theoretical model, I mean, I don't have a theoretical apparatus. I'm just saying it's, oil certainly played a role in 1953, the coup d'etat, the way that the Pahlavi monarchy was set up, calculations of over revenues from oil, and then also the loss of legitimacy of the Pahlavi dynasty after 1953 led to the way that the most transformative event in process in Iranian history, the land reform and the white revolution, were carried out in the 60s. I mean, the state was able to do things that it wouldn't have been if it wasn't able to rely on oil revenues. In the 70s, again, in post 73, the oil revenue boost allowed the state to do things, and the monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to do things that really delegitimized him. I don't think there's a mechanical way. I mean, that's the point of history, that, you can't, historians are sensitive about the kind of generalizations that other social scientists, sociologists, or political scientists, and so on and so forth, are willing to make. History is messy. And I don't want to kind of deny any of that messiness. But so let's say oil did play a big role in the way that in the political and social crises that led to the 1979. But 1979 wasn't about oil, and certainly wasn't just about Islam. It was about oil. It was about the role of religion as an institution, but it also had to do with the kind of social disruptions, the vast movements of population from the countryside, the visible display of social inequality, but also with the fact that Iranian political culture had this long history of subaltern struggles, in the constitutional revolution, against oil, against the hegemony of multinational oil companies, oil nationalism of 1950s, and then the political movements of the left that became smaller and smaller because they were radical and militarized, so they involved fewer people. But the existing political culture, which had become urban by late 1970s, allowed this kind of mobilization to challenge an all-powerful monarchy from the bottom by this mass protests and mass strikes and mass movements that lasted the whole year despite military reprisals. So I certainly don't have a political apparatus. If I want to make one explanation, I agree with Ervan Abrahamian's take that this was a combined crisis of political loss of legitimacy and underdevelopment, and then an overheated increasingly oil-based, speculative economy that had created, major financial upheavals, and that kind of really shook the whole foundations of the monarchy at that time.
Perfect, thank you. By way of ending, Kaveh, can you just briefly point? I know you said you will be your next project or your current project broadens the scope and looks at this comparatively. Just very quickly, what parallels have you been able to draw so far between what you've observed with the social history of oil workers in Iran and those, for example, in nearby areas like Kuwait? I don't know if you've done any work on Kuwait, but it strikes me that a lot of the dynamics that you've described here have parallels, particularly in a place like Kuwait.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that a few years back, I was part of this fantastic workshop organized by my colleagues at for MESA. Sorry, I'm having a mental block right now. Nelida Fukaro, I apologize. So a number of her students, myself, Nelida, had this presentation about, and there were all these like then students, now like established scholars, like Farah Al-Nakhib, who has worked on fantastic work on, on Kuwait, Arbela Bet Shlimon, who's worked on, on Iraq and Kirkuk. So there's a lot of people who, a lot of new younger scholars who are kind of have started really producing from this perspective of looking at the built environment and urban history, as a way of looking into the wider history. Because again, the point is that what the urban angle and what the built environment allows us to see is where do all these different actors interact actually? The built environment of all these cities, this kind of architecture, this kind of designed housing, these neighborhoods that are not controlled, that are, completely, squatted, and, the built infrastructure, who's maintaining it? Looking at these, at this geography of the built environment is not just looking at structures without souls and without people. Once you begin to populate them with people and say, well, what roles did they play in shaping this, or how were they shaped by these, designs and built environments? What kind of expertise went into this? What kind of negotiations? What kind of, coercions were involved? Then, that entry point allows us to actually analyze in a way the impact of oil on politics, on society, and everyday relations and environments that we wouldn't gain if we just looked at oil as an economy, or if we had looked at oil as a corporate sector, or oil, through the lens of the policies and the fight over, share of revenues from oil, by the government or not. Those are important. Those perspectives on oil are important. They're the ones that prevail. Everybody writes about them. What does the Saudi government do with this oil? How much does it get? What is the role of Aramco and all that? What kind of expertise do they have? I mean, if you can get into, Saudi Arabia is not open to investigation or research, as far as I know. But if you do look at the built environment, then we suddenly see all of these things come together at a space where everybody has to interact. So, theoretically, but also methodologically, I think that has been an important argument, and I'm very glad that I was part of it, because I started writing about this in 1999, and it's become, and at least in the Middle East, and elsewhere. I mean, Latin America, Russia, like there's a more and more fantastic work and investigations that are coming out that actually look at this everyday geographic social life of oil as a way of explaining and also engaging critically with its legacies and how it is shaping our world.
Professor, this has been absolutely terrific. I am so grateful to you, and I'm sure so is our audience here in Doha and throughout the world. This is a really fascinating topic. I do hope that you come back and revisit us in a year or so, and when your research is on the comparative scope of this is further along, and share with us more of your insights. Kaveh, I am really grateful. Thank you so very much. My sincere thanks to all the colleagues behind the scene that have made this possible. Hamida Dorzadeh, our interpreters, everyone in the audiovisual team, and of course, foremost, Professor Kaveh Ehsani. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.